When I arrived at my sister's wedding and said my name, the venue staff looked completely confused. He scanned his clipboard carefully and told me my name was not there. I called my sister to ask what was going on, and she simply sneered. She asked if I really thought I would be invited to the most important day of her life. So I left quietly and placed a black velvet gift box on the reception table. Hours later, what she saw inside that box made her call me nonstop, but I never answered. My name is Zuri, and I am 29 years old. Growing up in the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta, image was the only currency my family truly valued. Today was supposed to be the crowning achievement for my parents. My sister Chloe was marrying Preston Kensington, a man whose family represented old Southern money. It was the ultimate social validation my parents had spent decades chasing. I stood outside the towering iron gates of the Rosewood Estate, the afternoon sun warming my emerald silk dress. The security guard stepped out of his booth, looking me up and down with obvious suspicion. When I gave him my full name, his demeanor shifted from professional to outright hostile. He checked his clipboard again and informed me that Evelyn Davis, the mother of the bride, had placed me on a strict, restricted list. He said I was banned from entering the property and threatened to call the local police if I caused a scene. I did not argue with the guard. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed Chloe. She answered almost immediately, the sound of clinking champagne glasses and string music echoing loudly in the background. I told her security was blocking me at the front gate. Her laughter sliced through the phone line, sharp and incredibly cruel. She asked why a ghetto teen mother thought she belonged at a high society wedding. She reminded me that my presence would only humiliate her in front of Preston and his refined white relatives. Her harsh words were meant to break my spirit, but they only reminded me of the night my parents threw me out of our house 10 years ago. I was 19 and pregnant. My mother, a proud member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, and my father, a prominent country club executive, decided my unexpected pregnancy was a fatal blow to their carefully curated image of Black excellence. They packed my belongings in black garbage bags, tossed them onto the lawn in the pouring rain, and changed the locks. They told their country club friends I had moved away for a study abroad program. They completely erased me to protect their fragile social standing. Chloe continued her vicious rant over the phone. She said the Kensingtons were a prestigious family and she would not let my tragic life ruin her flawless aesthetic. She told me to go back to whatever miserable existence I was living and stay away from people who actually mattered. I listened to her venom without shedding a single tear. The younger version of me might have wept and begged for a seat at her table. The woman standing at the gate today felt nothing but absolute chilling calm. I told Chloe I completely understood her position. I said I just wanted to drop off a wedding gift for the happy couple. She scoffed loudly and told me to leave my trash at the security booth before she called the cops. She ended the call abruptly. I handed the black velvet box to the stunned guard. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to ensure the bride opens it before they cut the cake. I turned my back on the massive estate and walked away without a second glance. I did not walk towards a bus stop or a struggling vehicle. I walked toward the sleek black Maybach waiting quietly at the edge of the private road. My driver opened the door and I slid into the luxurious leather interior. As we pulled away from the beautiful venue, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from my mother. The message dripped with the same toxic elitism she had weaponized against me my entire life. She wrote that she saw me on the security cameras and called me a pathetic embarrassment. She demanded I stop trying to ruin their perfect weekend. She proudly stated she was currently hosting Preston's wealthy parents at the Ritz-Carlton, and my lingering shadow was ruining the elegant atmosphere. I read her message twice, allowing a genuine smile to spread across my face. My parents were so blinded by their desperate need for social climbing that they never bothered to verify the reality of their own finances. 2 years ago, my mother had secretly destroyed her credit score trying to keep up with the wealthy socialites she worshipped. Desperate to hide her financial ruin from my father, she begged me for help. Through a blind third-party corporation, I had quietly issued her a premium credit account. She had absolutely no idea she was literally spending my own money all this time. Right now, she was using that exact premium credit card to simply pay for 5 massive luxury hotel suites for the Kensington family, eager to prove she finally belonged in their extremely high tax bracket. I opened the secure banking application on my phone and navigated to her specific account. I saw the pending charges racking up thousands of dollars in hospitality fees. I did not reply to her cruel text message. Instead, I pressed the freeze account button. I locked the credit card permanently. My mother had just banned me from her daughter's wedding to protect her elite image. Now she could figure out exactly how to pay for it while standing at the front desk of a luxury hotel in front of her prestigious new in-laws. The silence inside the Maybach was a sharp contrast to the digital storm erupting in the palm of my hand. Less than 60 seconds after I froze the account, my phone began to vibrate violently against the leather armrest. My mother was panicking. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of frantic text messages. She demanded to know why the hotel concierge was looking at her like she was a common criminal. She typed in all capital letters that her premium card was just declined at the Ritz-Carlton front desk. She said Preston's mother was standing right next to her, watching the entire humiliating ordeal unfold. She ordered me to fix whatever glitch I had caused immediately before the Kensington family realized something was financially wrong. I sat back and watched the messages pour in. I could picture the exact shade of pale panic washing over my mother's meticulously contoured face. She had spent the last year bragging to her sorority sisters about footing the bill for the wealthy white in-laws. Now she was standing in one of the most expensive hotel lobbies in Atlanta holding a worthless piece of plastic. She sent another text demanding I transfer funds to her personal account right that second. She called me a selfish brat for playing games on the most important weekend of her life. I typed my response with deliberate slowness, making sure every single word carried the weight of the last 10 years. I wrote that there was no glitch. I reminded her that she had banned me from the venue and called me a stain on the family legacy. I typed the final sentence and hit send. You banned me. You pay for it. The phone rang immediately. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. I accepted the call and put it on speaker, setting the device on the center console. I did not say a word. I just let her voice fill the quiet luxury of the car. She was absolutely hysterical. Her voice shook with a mixture of rage and terror. She screamed that I was deliberately trying to destroy her social standing. She said Preston's mother had offered to pay the bill with a condescending smile that made my mother want to crawl under the marble floor. She yelled that I owed her this money for disgracing their image of black excellence a decade ago. She said my teenage pregnancy had brought shame to the Davis name, and paying for this wedding was the absolute least I could do to repay them for the trauma I caused. I let her scream until she had to pause for breath. Then I leaned forward and spoke with a terrifying calm. I asked her if she truly believed I owed her anything. I reminded her of what happened the week they threw me out. I was 19, terrified and holding a newborn baby. My mother had invited me to a diner under the guise of making peace. Instead, she slid a stack of legal documents across the table. She told me they were emancipation papers that would legally separate me from the family name, so my child would not ruin my father's impending promotion at the elite country club. I was exhausted and completely broken. I signed the papers without reading the fine print. I reminded her of that day through the phone. I told her I eventually found out what those papers actually were. They were not just emancipation forms. She had tricked me into signing away my entire college fund. She took the $80,000 my grandparents had left for my education and used it to buy a luxury vehicle to maintain her wealthy facade while her own daughter slept in a homeless shelter. I told her that ultimate betrayal completely canceled out any imaginary debt she thought I owed for ruining her flawless aesthetic. My mother gasped on the other end of the line. She stammered, trying to formulate an excuse, trying to weave another lie to cover the bitter truth. She said she needed that money to protect the family from the brutal scandal I created. She tried to justify stealing from her own flesh and blood by claiming it was for the greater good of the Davis legacy. I did not let her finish her pathetic explanation. I told her the bank was officially closed. I told her to enjoy the rest of the wedding she was so desperate to protect. I ended the call and blocked her number permanently. The car continued its smooth glide down the highway heading toward the city skyline. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled compartment. The taste of victory was incredibly sweet, but the main event had not even started yet. My family thought the frozen credit card was the ultimate revenge. They had absolutely no idea it was merely the opening act of a meticulously planned financial demolition. They believed they were invincible behind their high society walls. My phone buzzed again, but this time the custom ringtone indicated it was a secure business call. I picked it up immediately. It was David, my executive assistant and the most ruthless financial analyst on my payroll. His voice was crisp and strictly professional. He informed me that our covert operatives at the estate had just provided a real-time update. He said the wedding venue manager confirmed the bride and groom were currently moving toward the center of the lavish ballroom. They were gathering all the wealthy guests to witness them cut the massive 5-tier wedding cake. David paused for a brief second, waiting for my ultimate directive. He asked if he should initiate the targeted asset seizure protocols across all of their vulnerable accounts. I looked out the tinted window at the passing city. I thought about the velvet box resting on the reception table waiting to be opened. I smiled and said, "Do it now." The line went silent before David confirmed my order. He told me the asset seizure protocols were active. I disconnected the call and opened my laptop in the back seat of the Maybach. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, accessing the secure portal for Southern Heritage Trust. That was the prestigious boutique bank my father used for all his corporate accounts. My father always boasted about banking there because it catered exclusively to Atlanta high society. He loved the illusion of exclusivity. What he did not know was that my private equity firm Apex Vanguard had quietly acquired a controlling interest in that bank 8 months ago. I owned the vault holding his money. I navigated to my father's primary corporate account and watched the live transaction log. Right at the top of the screen, a massive wire transfer request was pending in red text. Preston Kensington was attempting to move $200,000 from my father's business account into an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Preston had convinced my father to give him joint access under the guise of a newly formed family investment partnership. My father was so desperate to impress his white son-in-law, he handed over the keys to his financial kingdom blindly. I did not hesitate. I executed a manual override and permanently blocked the wire transfer. A green notification popped up confirming the funds were locked. I stared at the blocked transaction, feeling a deep sense of poetic justice. Preston Kensington always carried himself with an unbearable level of arrogance. He wore his generational wealth like a heavy crown, expecting everyone to bow down. From the first day my sister brought him home, he made it a point to belittle me. He constantly threw racist microaggressions in my direction wrapped in polite Southern charm. During Thanksgiving dinner, he had the audacity to call me uneducated in front of the extended family. He made snide remarks about my teenage pregnancy, implying my existence brought down the value of the Davis family tree. He acted like a superior aristocrat, doing my sister a massive favor by marrying into our black family. But Preston was a massive fraud. Behind his tailored suits and smug smile, he was drowning in a spectacular amount of debt. His family secretly went bankrupt years ago. They had absolutely nothing left except a historic mansion they could no longer afford to maintain and a last name that opened doors. A year ago, Preston sent an anonymous email to one of my lending subsidiaries begging for a high-risk personal loan. He was trying to keep his family estate from falling into foreclosure. He had no idea he was begging the same black woman he constantly disrespected. I reviewed his loan application personally. I denied his request immediately. I then went ahead and bought up every single piece of his family debt. I owned him completely. I pushed the thoughts of Preston aside and switched to a different application on my screen. I opened the live security feed for the Rosewood Estate. My parents spent months bragging about securing this venue because it was notoriously difficult to book. They told all their sorority sisters and country club friends it cost a fortune to reserve the grand ballroom. They were right about the price tag. It was incredibly expensive. What they completely failed to realize was that Apex Vanguard purchased the entire Rosewood property portfolio during a corporate liquidation sale last winter. My family was currently hosting the social event of the season on my private property. I split my screen to view multiple camera angles. The high-definition cameras captured every corner of the lavish wedding reception. I saw my mother standing near the grand staircase. She was forcing a tight smile while talking to a group of wealthy older women. I knew she was internally panicking about her frozen credit card, but she desperately tried to maintain her flawless facade. In another feed, I spotted my father. He was holding a glass of expensive bourbon, laughing loudly with some corporate colleagues. He looked so proud. He believed he finally secured his ultimate legacy by marrying his favorite daughter into the Kensington dynasty. He had no clue his company bank accounts were frozen and his son-in-law was robbing him blind. I shifted my attention to a camera panning across the main ballroom floor. I finally located Preston. He stood near the towering floral arrangements looking down at his cell phone. His face was entirely flushed, and he was sweating through the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He stared at the notification from the bank informing him his offshore wire transfer was blocked due to suspected fraudulent activity. I watched him run a trembling hand through his hair. The arrogant Southern gentleman was experiencing a total nervous breakdown in real time. He tried to quickly dial a number, but he was visibly shaking. His entire exit strategy was collapsing right in front of his eyes. I smiled and dragged my cursor to the final security feed. I clicked on the camera angled directly over the main reception desk in the front lobby. The crystal chandeliers illuminated the area perfectly. Sitting right in the center of the polished marble table was the black velvet box I left behind earlier. I watched the screen intently as my sister Chloe walked into the frame. She wore her custom designer wedding gown, looking around the empty lobby with a frustrated expression on her face. She stomped over to the reception desk and glared down at the velvet box. She probably thought I left a cheap trinket or a desperate apology letter inside. I leaned closer to my screen and watched her manicured hands reach out. She grabbed the lid of the box. It was finally time for the unboxing. I took a deep breath and watched her perfect world shatter into a million broken pieces right before my very own eyes. The high-definition security camera captured every single micro-expression on my sister's face as she lifted the black velvet lid. Chloe reached inside and pulled out the first document I had meticulously prepared for her. It was printed on premium heavy cardstock featuring the official corporate letterhead of the property management group I secretly controlled. It was a direct invoice for $150,000 covering the exclusive rental fee for the Rosewood Estate. The payment was marked due immediately upon receipt. I watched her read the bold text at the top of the page. Her flawless bridal smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She turned the paper over, probably looking for a punchline or a signature confirming it was a joke. I had specifically instructed my legal team to list my name at the very bottom as the sole proprietor and landlord of the estate. Chloe scoffed and shook her head, letting out a nervous laugh that rippled through her heavily beaded gown. She waved the invoice in the air, motioning for one of her bridesmaids to come over. She pointed at the paper, acting as if her estranged sister had simply lost her mind and delivered a fake bill as a pathetic prank. But her forced amusement vanished completely when she reached her manicured hand back into the box and pulled out the second item. This document was much thicker and bound with a rigid legal clip. It was an official bank-certified foreclosure notice for the historic Kensington family mansion. The paperwork clearly outlined decades of unpaid property taxes, massive defaulted loans, and a complete liquidation order. The Kensington family had successfully maintained the illusion of supreme generational wealth for years. They drove vintage European sports cars and hosted charity galas, but it was all built on a mountain of high-interest debt. Preston and his elitist parents went entirely bankrupt when he was just a teenager. They had nothing left except their arrogant entitlement and a desperate need to maintain their social superiority. When Preston met my sister, he did not see a partner. He saw a highly lucrative opportunity. He targeted my parents specifically because he knew they suffered from an extreme case of internalized inferiority. My mother and father were so blindingly eager to achieve proximity to whiteness that they willingly ignored every single financial red flag. They practically threw their hard-earned money at Preston, believing his white aristocrat status would magically elevate their own position in Atlanta high society. The Kensingtons were nothing but sophisticated leeches using a wealthy black family to pay off their massive generational failures. I watched through the digital feed as Chloe stared blankly at the foreclosure notice. Her eyes darted rapidly across the legal jargon, detailing how her perfect white prince was actually a broke con artist facing imminent eviction. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped and her chest heaved as she struggled to pull oxygen into her tightly corseted lungs. She looked around the grand lobby, suddenly terrified that the elegant guests sipping champagne in the adjacent ballroom were about to discover she was marrying an absolute fraud. My parents had drained their retirement accounts to fund this extravagant wedding, all so Chloe could proudly claim the Kensington name. Now she was holding ironclad proof that the prestigious name she worshipped was entirely worthless. I leaned closer to the monitor in my car, mesmerized by the chaotic unraveling of her precious fairy tale. For 10 long years, my sister had relentlessly mocked my struggles. When I was working double shifts at a diner to buy diapers, she was swiping my parents' credit cards to buy designer handbags. When I was teaching myself financial literacy late at night, in a cramped apartment, she was busy posting photos on social media, bragging about her luxurious lifestyle. She never once missed an opportunity to remind me that I was the ultimate disappointment, while she was the undeniable golden child. She truly believed her proximity to Preston made her untouchable. But the truth was finally staring her right in the face. She was not a queen ascending to a throne. She was a naive pawn being marched straight to the slaughterhouse. Chloe dropped the foreclosure notice onto the marble reception table, as if the paper itself had physically burned her fingers. She leaned against the desk, taking deep, unsteady breaths, trying to compose herself before any of the high society guests noticed her panic. She reached into the velvet box one final time. Her fingers brushed against the third and most important item I had left for her. It was a custom-engraved metallic USB drive. The shiny surface caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. I had anticipated exactly how she would react to this specific piece of technology. Chloe was incredibly predictable. Her massive ego always dictated her actions. She stared at the small silver drive, and her tense posture began to relax just a fraction. I knew exactly what she was thinking. In her delusional mind, she convinced herself that the invoices and legal documents were just my aggressive way of getting her attention. She assumed the USB drive contained a sappy, emotional slideshow. She probably thought I had compiled adorable childhood photos and recorded a desperate weeping apology, begging for her forgiveness on her wedding day. She wanted to humiliate me further by broadcasting my supposed surrender to her elite crowd. She grabbed the metallic drive with a renewed sense of arrogant confidence. She signaled to her bridesmaids and marched directly into the center of the grand ballroom, heading straight for the professional equipment located at the elevated DJ booth. She handed the silver drive to the technician, instructing him to play it on the massive screens immediately. I smiled as he plugged it in. The real show was finally about to begin right now. She had absolutely no idea what was truly coming for her today. The DJ plugged the silver drive into his master laptop. The massive projection screens behind the dance floor flickered to life. Chloe stood in the center of the grand ballroom with a smug smile on her face. She adjusted her diamond tiara and waited for my supposed public apology to begin. The elegant string quartet stopped playing. The hundreds of wealthy guests turned their attention toward the stage. Instead of a slideshow of childhood memories, a stark black screen appeared. Then a voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. It was crystal clear and unmistakable. It was Preston. The audio was a high-quality recording captured by a private investigator I had hired months ago. Preston was sitting in a luxury country club locker room bragging loudly to his groomsmen. His thick southern drawl echoed across the silent ballroom. He laughed and told his friends that marrying into the Davis family was the easiest scam of his entire life. He called my parents desperate new money, black folks who were so obsessed with his white pedigree that they practically handed him their bank account passwords. He used vile racial slurs to describe my father and his country club achievements. He mocked my mother's desperate attempts to fit in with his elitist mother, calling her a pathetic social climber who would overlook anything for a proximity to whiteness. The entire ballroom collectively gasped. The elite black socialites of Atlanta stood completely frozen in horror. I watched the live security feed as Evelyn dropped her expensive crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered against the polished marble floor, but the sound was entirely drowned out by Preston's recorded voice. The audio continued playing relentlessly. Preston bragged about his master plan. He explicitly detailed how he intended to drain every single cent from my father's retirement funds to pay off his own massive generational debts. He laughed cruelly and announced he would file for divorce the second the accounts were empty, leaving Chloe with absolutely nothing but a ruined reputation. Preston turned ghost white. The blood completely drained from his face as his darkest secrets were broadcast to the entire reception. He dropped his drink and sprinted frantically toward the elevated DJ booth. He screamed at the technician to cut the audio immediately. The DJ scrambled over his equipment, hitting buttons and pulling cords, but nothing worked. I had my cybersecurity team embed a malicious code within the audio file. The moment it was plugged in, it locked the entire sound system and bypassed all the manual volume controls. Preston ripped the main power cord out of the wall, but the venue ran on a synchronized backup generator I had installed when I purchased the property. The recording simply looped back to the beginning and played even louder. The humiliation was absolute and entirely unavoidable. The wealthy guests who my parents had spent years trying to impress were now recording the chaos on their smartphones. The illusion of black excellence and high society perfection my mother worshipped was burning to the ground in spectacular fashion. She stood near the main staircase, clutching her chest as she realized her ultimate social victory was actually a devastating financial trap. She had alienated her own daughter to protect a white man who viewed her family as nothing more than a disposable bank. My father, Marcus Sr., stood frozen by the bar, looking like a broken man. The man who threw me into the street for ruining his image was now publicly exposed as a gullible fool who let a racist con artist steal his legacy. Chloe stood completely paralyzed in the center of the dance floor. Her arrogant smile was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of pure terror. She looked at Preston, who was still violently thrashing against the sound equipment, trying to silence his own voice. She looked at the prestigious guests, who were now whispering, pointing, and shaking their heads in absolute disgust. Preston's elitist white mother tried to cover her face and rush out of the room, but the crowd of angry bridesmaids blocked her path. Chloe finally realized that every single warning sign she ignored because of his skin color and last name had just exploded right in her face. She was not the ultimate envy of Atlanta society ascending to a wealthy throne. She was the punchline of the most humiliating and destructive joke in the city. I sat comfortably in the back seat of my Maybach, watching the magnificent disaster unfold on my dual split screens. A deep and overwhelming sense of vindication washed over my entire body. They had thrown me out into the pouring rain 10 years ago because my mere existence threatened their fake social standing. They banned me from this very venue today because they believed I was a failure who belonged far beneath them. Now they were trapped inside a horrific nightmare of their own making, and I was the one holding the keys to all the exits. I had built a private equity empire from nothing, while they built a house of cards on bad credit and self-hatred. My phone suddenly vibrated against the leather console, breaking my intense focus on the security video feeds. I looked down at the bright screen lighting up the dark interior of the car. It was an incoming FaceTime request. The caller identification displayed my sister's name in bold letters. Chloe was calling me. She must have fled the grand ballroom and locked herself in the bridal suite the moment the reality of the situation finally crushed her massive ego. She wanted to scream at the top of her lungs. She wanted to demand answers and find a desperate way to blame me for exposing the monster she willingly chose to marry. I took a slow sip of my chilled, sparkling water. I adjusted my posture, making sure the luxurious interior of my vehicle was perfectly visible. I calmly pressed the green button. Chloe appeared on screen. Her flawless bridal makeup was ruined by streams of thick black mascara running down her cheeks. The background was a blur of chaotic movement in the suite. I could hear the muffled sounds of shouting from the grand ballroom just outside her door. Chloe was gasping for air, gripping her shaking phone. She did not start with her usual insults or arrogant commands. Instead, she begged me. She pleaded with a desperate, cracking voice, asking me to tell her this was just a horrible prank. She begged me to call the venue manager and announce over the speakers that the audio was a sophisticated deepfake generated by AI. She promised she would forgive my trespassing if I just saved her from this ultimate public humiliation. I maintained my relaxed posture against the leather seat. I let her stare at my calm expression and the undeniable luxury surrounding me. I did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. I spoke with surgical precision, breaking down her reality. I told her the recording was not a deepfake. I gave her the exact date and time the audio was captured. I told her it was recorded last Thursday at 4 in the afternoon inside the country club locker room. I explained how Preston was sipping imported scotch with his groomsmen, feeling safe among privileged white men. I told her he felt so incredibly secure in his aristocratic bubble that he freely admitted he was using a wealthy black family as a disposable stepping stone to clear his own bankruptcy. Chloe sobbed loudly, shaking her head in aggressive denial. She repeated that Preston loved her and would never say those vile things about our parents. Before she could continue her delusion, a large hand suddenly snatched the phone from her grip. Preston's face filled the screen. He was sweating profusely, and his expensive tuxedo collar was completely unbuttoned. His eyes were wide with panic, but he tried to project his usual aura of untouchable white privilege. He glared at the camera and pointed a shaking finger at me. He demanded I shut down the audio immediately or he would destroy my entire life. He puffed out his chest and resorted to his favorite weapon. He threatened me with a massive defamation lawsuit. He promised to unleash his family's prestigious legal team to sue me for slander and severe emotional distress. He swore he would drag my name through the mud and ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life paying off legal fees. He sneered and called me a jealous, bitter woman who fabricated evidence because I could not stand seeing my sister marry into a superior social class. Listening to his desperate threats brought back a flood of infuriating memories. This was the exact same intimidation tactic Preston used against me for years. Whenever I attended those suffocating family dinners and dared to question his vague business ventures or his lack of tangible assets, he would immediately threaten legal action. He used to laugh and tell my parents that an uneducated dropout like me lacked the basic financial literacy to understand complex wealth management. He constantly used the threat of his powerful lawyers to silence me and force my parents to blindly trust his empty promises. He always relied on the intimidating weight of the Kensington name to bully anyone who dared to look behind his curtain of lies. But his name carried absolutely no weight in my world anymore. I looked at his red, sweating face through the screen, and I laughed. It was not a quiet chuckle, but a full and genuine laugh of pure amusement. My laughter echoed in the quiet cabin of the car, and I watched Preston's arrogant expression falter. He demanded to know what I found so funny about a federal defamation lawsuit. I stopped laughing and leaned closer to the camera. I told him he was in absolutely no position to threaten anyone with a lawsuit when he was currently facing decades in federal prison. I told him to pull out his phone and check his email inbox right that very second. Preston scoffed and tried to dismiss my command, but the sheer confidence in my voice made him hesitate. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out his personal smartphone. I watched his eyes dart down to the screen as he opened his email application. He expected to see another declined transaction or a panicked message from his bankrupt parents. Instead, he opened a direct message forwarded from the cybersecurity division of Apex Vanguard. Attached to the message was a heavily detailed draft of a federal indictment document. I watched the color completely drain from his face for the second time that afternoon. His lips parted, but no sound came out. I narrated exactly what he was looking at so Chloe could hear every single word in the background. I told him he was reading a comprehensive dossier detailing his continuous efforts to commit international wire fraud. I explained that I had legally intercepted his $200,000 transfer to the Cayman Islands just 30 minutes ago. I informed him that I did not just block the transaction to protect my father's corporate account. I compiled his entire history of financial embezzlement, his forged loan applications, and his offshore evasion tactics into one neat digital package. Preston stared at the screen, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped both phones. He looked back up at the camera, his false bravado completely shattered. He opened his mouth to offer a desperate negotiation to settle this like civilized business partners. But I cut him off before he could utter a single word. I told him I had already forwarded the entire unredacted dossier directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I smiled warmly and told him to enjoy his honeymoon behind bars and completely alone. Preston stared at the screen with hollow, lifeless eyes. The gravity of the federal indictment finally shattered his arrogant illusion. His trembling fingers lost their grip on the smartphone. The device tumbled from his hands and clattered onto the hardwood floor of the bridal suite. The video feed abruptly spun out of focus before settling on a dizzying view of the ornate ceiling. I heard Chloe wailing hysterically in the background, her desperate cries echoing through the dropped phone. Then the connection completely severed. The screen went black. I placed my phone face down on the leather center console. I immediately shifted my full attention back to the live security feeds displayed across my laptop. The situation inside the grand ballroom was rapidly deteriorating into absolute madness. The looping audio recording of Preston spewing vile racist slurs had finally stopped playing, but the heavy silence that followed was somehow even more deafening. The hundreds of elite guests stood frozen in a state of collective shock. Then the chaotic shouting began. Preston's mother, a woman who proudly traced her lineage back to Confederate generals, marched straight into the center of the dance floor. Her face was flushed bright fiery red. She was shaking with indignant rage. She completely dropped her polite Southern charm and exposed the ugly bigotry she had been hiding all along. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my mother Evelyn and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that her son was the absolute best thing that ever happened to the Davis family. She called my parents uncultured thugs who should have been endlessly grateful that a Kensington even bothered to look in their general direction. She screamed that our new money was tainted and worthless compared to her own historic pedigree. She boldly declared that Preston was completely justified in taking their funds because people like my parents did not possess the intellectual capacity to manage real wealth. She stood in the middle of my luxury estate and spewed aggressive racist venom at the very people who had just drained their retirement accounts to fund her lavish hotel suites. I watched my mother Evelyn closely on the high-definition monitor. For her entire adult life, she had meticulously built her identity around appearing absolutely perfect to these exact society women. She dedicated decades to climbing the social ladder, joining elite sororities. She spent her time attending the right charity galas and curating a flawless image of Black excellence. She threw her own daughter out into the street to protect that fragile illusion. Now she was standing in front of her elite peers, realizing she had sacrificed her flesh and blood for a blatant con artist. She had bankrupted her husband and alienated her child just to be racially abused by a bankrupt white woman in front of the entire city of Atlanta. Something inside Evelyn completely snapped. The polished country club facade evaporated completely in a single second. She let out a guttural scream of pure, unfiltered rage and lunged directly at Preston's mother. The two women collided violently in the middle of the dance floor. Evelyn grabbed the older woman by her expensive pearl necklace and yanked her downward. Preston's mother shrieked and clawed frantically at Evelyn's custom beaded designer gown. The luxurious mother of the bride dress ripped audibly down the side, exposing the silk lining underneath. They crashed into a towering floral arrangement, sending hundreds of white roses and crystal vases shattering across the polished marble. The pristine wedding reception instantly transformed into chaotic violence. The elite Black socialites, the very women my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress, did not step forward to break up the fight. Instead, they simultaneously reached into their designer evening bags and pulled out their smartphones. I watched dozens of camera flashes light up the ballroom as Atlanta's high society recorded every single humiliating second of my mother's total destruction. They captured her ruined dress, her frantic screaming, and her complete loss of dignity. The footage would be circulating through every exclusive group chat and private country club text thread before the night was completely over. Evelyn's carefully crafted reputation was permanently incinerated. Preston rushed out of the bridal suite and sprinted into the ballroom, trying to pry my mother off his shrieking parent. My father, Marcus Sr., finally snapped out of his paralyzed daze. He charged across the room and tackled Preston, shoving the younger man hard against the catering tables. Silverware clattered to the floor as the two men began shoving each other violently. The elegant groomsmen and the confused venue staff rushed into the fray, creating a massive tangled knot of shouting, pushing, and absolute mayhem. The fairy tale wedding had become a disaster. It was the most spectacular social failure in the history of the city. I sat back in my car and took a very deep breath. The chaotic scene playing out on my laptop screen was a masterpiece of karmic justice. Every single person who had judged me, belittled me, and treated me like disposable trash was currently fighting in a pile of ruined flowers and shattered glass. They were destroying themselves exactly as I had predicted. But I was not quite finished with them yet. It was time to clear out my property. I sent a quick automated signal directly. The alert went to the venue manager. On the security feed, I saw him immediately straighten his suit jacket and walk briskly toward the stage. He bypassed the broken equipment and grabbed the emergency microphone connected to the main public address system. The sharp feedback whine of the microphone pierced through the shouting, cutting through the brawl and forcing everyone to freeze. The manager stood tall and spoke with unwavering professional authority. His voice echoed clearly across the ruined ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the owner of this estate requires the premises vacated immediately due to non-payment. Security is arriving." I watched the venue manager usher the screaming guests toward the exit on my high-definition security feed. The grand ballroom was completely empty, except for the shattered glass and trampled white roses scattered across the marble floor. My phone vibrated again against the leather seat of the Maybach. This time, the caller identification displayed my father. Marcus Sr. was finally calling me. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear, expecting a semblance of realization or regret. I should have known better than to expect basic human decency from him. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for Preston calling him a new money thug just minutes prior. His voice was rigid with authoritarian anger. He demanded I call off my security guards and cancel the $150,000 venue invoice immediately. He ordered me to stop throwing a childish tantrum and fix the massive embarrassment I had just caused his family. He actually had the audacity to command me to fix a situation he allowed a racist con artist to create. I listened to his booming voice echo through the phone line. He told me I was acting like a bitter, jealous woman who wanted to ruin a beautiful day. He said if I did not reverse the charges and issue a public apology to Chloe, he would permanently cut me out of the family business. He threatened to remove my name from his corporate will and ensure I never saw a single dime of his hard-earned wealth. He promised to make sure I remained a broke single mother for the rest of my miserable life. I let him finish his arrogant monologue. Then I reminded him of a quiet night exactly 10 years ago. I was sitting in our home office, heavily pregnant, and typing code on a customized computer. I had developed a revolutionary scheduling and logistics application designed specifically for high-end hospitality management. I showed it to my father, hoping to make him proud of my potential. Instead, he copied my original source code onto his personal drive while I was asleep. When he threw me out onto the street the following week, he took my intellectual property directly to his corporate board. He presented my application as his own brilliant innovation. He used the very code I wrote while carrying my daughter to secure his prestigious executive position at the country club. He built his entire fake empire on the back of my stolen genius. My father went completely silent on the other end of the line. The absolute shock of being confronted with his decade-old theft stripped away his aggressive corporate persona. I told him he had absolutely no wealth to withhold from me because every single dollar he earned over the last 10 years was generated by my stolen algorithms. I explained that I never bothered to sue him for intellectual property theft because I knew a much more devastating way to take back what belonged to me. He stammered and tried to deny the accusation, claiming he merely optimized my amateur project to make it commercially viable. He said I was just an ungrateful child who never understood the complex nature of corporate software development. I cut his pathetic excuses short. I told him his empty threats about cutting me out of his business were incredibly amusing because he no longer had a business to cut me out of. He demanded to know what I was talking about. His voice trembled with a sudden, overwhelming panic. He asked if I was planning to file a retroactive patent lawsuit that would tie up his assets in court. I laughed softly. I instructed him to step away from the crying socialites in the crowded lobby and open his corporate financial portal right this very second. I told him to look very closely at the major shareholder distribution list for his beloved company. I heard the rustling of fabric and the frantic tapping of a phone screen as he struggled to load the application. My father gasped loudly. The sharp intake of breath told me he had finally found the updated corporate registry. I clinically explained exactly what he was looking at. I told him that my private equity firm Apex Vanguard had spent the last 48 hours aggressively buying up every single available share of his parent company through an untraceable network of shell corporations. We executed a flawless hostile takeover while he was busy sipping expensive bourbon and celebrating a fraudulent white son-in-law. I informed him that Apex Vanguard was now the undisputed majority shareholder, holding exactly 72% of his corporate voting rights. I told him he was no longer the untouchable chief executive officer he pretended to be. I told him he was now my direct subordinate and his position was officially under review by my human resources department. I smiled as I heard his breathing turn into ragged, desperate wheezing. I told him to pack up his corner office immediately because I was sending my personal security team to revoke his corporate access badge first thing Monday morning. The line went completely dead. I set my phone down and took a deep breath. My father was finally paying the price for his theft. The empire he stole from me was officially back in my hands. The heavy silence that followed his sudden disconnection was incredibly satisfying. He had spent his entire life trying to control my narrative and destroy my confidence. Now he was left standing in a ruined ballroom with absolutely nothing to his name. The generational wealth he bragged about was completely gone. The legacy he prized over his own child was utterly destroyed. My victory was absolute. It was time to leave this tragic circus behind and focus on the one person who actually mattered. I tapped the partition glass and instructed my driver to head toward the academy. The heavy privacy partition slowly rolled down, and Thomas nodded from the driver's seat. He steered the Maybach away from the highway and took the scenic route toward the prestigious Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. The transition from the chaotic energy of the ruined wedding to the quiet tree-lined streets of the Academy District gave me a moment to breathe. I watched the sprawling mansions and manicured lawns pass by my window. My heart rate finally began to slow down to a steady rhythm. The elaborate revenge I just executed against my parents and my sister was undeniably satisfying. But none of that corporate maneuvering or financial destruction was the true driving force behind my relentless ambition. My entire empire was built for one specific reason. I built it for Maya. 10 years ago, my mother stood in our grand foyer and pointed a shaking finger at my slightly rounded stomach. She called my unborn daughter a ghetto mistake. She screamed that Maya would be a permanent stain on the flawless Davis family portrait. My father told me I was throwing away my future to become a tragic statistical stereotype. They treated my pregnancy like a terminal disease that threatened to infect their precious high society status. They threw me out because they firmly believed my child would ruin their proximity to the wealthy white elites they desperately worshipped. They were entirely wrong about everything. Maya was never a mistake. She was the absolute greatest blessing of my entire life. My daughter is a brilliant academic prodigy. By the time she was 7 years old, she was already reading at a high school level and solving complex mathematical equations. While my sister Chloe was busy spending our parents' stolen money on designer handbags and pointless vacations, Maya was winning national science competitions. I spent my early 20s working grueling double shifts just to afford her advanced tutoring. I taught myself to code and analyze financial markets late at night because I refused to let my brilliant child grow up begging for acceptance. I created Apex Vanguard specifically to build a fortress of untouchable wealth around her. I made sure she would never have to shrink herself to fit into the narrow judgmental boxes my parents tried to force me into. My family thought they threw away a burden, but they actually discarded a genius. The Maybach glided to a smooth stop in front of the ornate wrought iron gates of the academy. The elite private school was a fortress of privilege catering exclusively to the wealthiest families in Atlanta. I stepped out of the luxurious vehicle and smoothed the emerald silk of my dress. My personal security detail, a towering man named Marcus, stepped out of the trailing SUV and flanked me immediately. He maintained a respectful distance, but kept his eyes scanning the perimeter with professional intensity. I walked toward the majestic brick building, waiting for the final dismissal bell to ring. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard. Dozens of wealthy parents stood nearby, chatting in small exclusive circles. Suddenly, a harsh, aggressive voice shattered the polite atmosphere of the courtyard. I turned around and saw a woman stomping directly toward me. Her blonde hair was a messy, tangled bird nest, and her expensive designer dress looked completely disheveled. It took me a fraction of a second to recognize her. It was Beatrice Kensington. She was Preston's older sister. I had only seen her a handful of times during the agonizing wedding rehearsal events my mother forced me to observe from afar. Beatrice always carried the same arrogant, racist entitlement as her brother and her mother. She believed her white skin and her historic last name gave her the absolute right to trample over anyone she deemed inferior. Beatrice marched up to me with her face twisted in an ugly snarl of pure rage. She pointed a shaking manicured finger inches from my face. She screamed that I was a vicious, vindictive monster who was illegally destroying her family legacy. She yelled loud enough for all the wealthy parents in the courtyard to hear. She demanded I call off my lawyers and immediately drop the foreclosure proceedings against her precious historic mansion. She claimed her family built Atlanta, and people like me had absolutely no right to seize their ancestral home. She threatened to use her vast political connections to have me investigated for corporate fraud and harassment. She stepped even closer, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me into backing down. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at her sweating, flushed face with absolute clinical detachment. She was throwing a pathetic public tantrum because she finally realized her family was entirely bankrupt and completely powerless. She expected me to cower in fear just like my desperate, socially anxious parents would have done. But I was not my mother. I did not worship her fading white aristocracy. I owned her debt. I owned her future. I owned the very ground she was currently threatening me on. Before Beatrice could hurl another racist insult, my security chief Marcus stepped seamlessly between us. He did not raise his voice or show any sign of aggressive anger. He simply used his massive frame to block her advance. He calmly informed her that she was invading my personal space and instructed her to step back immediately. Beatrice scoffed and tried to push past him, screaming that she would not be silenced by hired help. Marcus did not budge an inch. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He handed the paperwork directly to Beatrice with a stern nod. I smiled widely and casually explained exactly what she was holding. It was a permanent restraining order, explicitly banning her from coming anywhere near me or my brilliant daughter. Her entire face fell in complete and utter humiliating defeat. She was entirely powerless. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse. I stood on the sprawling glass balcony, holding a cup of black coffee and looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The city was buzzing with vibrant energy, but inside my highly secure residence, everything was perfectly quiet and strictly controlled. I took a slow sip of my coffee and opened my tablet to review the morning news. The digital world was currently on fire. The chaotic events from the Rosewood Estate had officially reached the local media networks and the most exclusive social blogs across the state. The headlines were incredibly aggressive and highly entertaining. High society wedding brawl exposes generational fraud. Aristocratic groom caught on tape, using racial slurs while stealing from wealthy black family. The videos recorded by the elite guests were circulating everywhere. You could clearly see my mother wrestling in the shattered floral arrangements and Preston sweating in absolute panic. My dedicated public relations team at Apex Vanguard had been working tirelessly through the night. I paid them exceptionally well to ensure the media narrative remained firmly focused on Preston Kensington and his massive financial scam. They strategically leaked anonymous tips to prominent journalists outlining the exact depth of his family bankruptcy. They made sure the public discourse highlighted his racist manipulation without ever revealing my personal identity or my corporate involvement. The media completely devoured the story of a fake white aristocrat exploiting an image-obsessed black family. The Davis family name, which my parents had spent decades trying to elevate, was now synonymous with utter foolishness and public humiliation. They were the laughingstock of the exact community they worshipped. I walked back inside and set my coffee mug on the kitchen island. My personal phone lit up with a continuous barrage of new text messages. They were from Chloe. I had not blocked her number yet because I knew her spectacular meltdown was inevitable, and I needed to monitor her erratic behavior. I opened the messages and read through her desperate, frantic paragraphs. She was completely broken. Her words were a chaotic mixture of intense sobbing and bitter accusations. She blamed me for absolutely everything that had gone wrong. She typed that I had maliciously destroyed her one chance at true happiness out of pure spite. She claimed I ruined her life because I was inherently jealous of her flawless beauty and her elite social standing within the community. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own flesh and blood on her special day. She completely ignored the fact that her groom was a blatant racist and a criminal. Reading her messages brought back a rush of highly irritating childhood memories. Chloe had always been a master manipulator. Growing up, she constantly played the innocent victim after initiating brutal attacks against me. If she ruined my school projects or stole my belongings, she would immediately run to our mother crying fake tears. She would claim I was bullying her, and my parents would instantly punish me to protect their golden child. She spent her entire life weaponizing her tears to avoid any real accountability for her terrible actions. She firmly believed that if she cried hard enough, the world would simply bend to her will. She expected me to feel a sudden surge of overwhelming guilt for exposing the monster she had chosen to marry. She wanted me to apologize for saving her from a man who planned to drain her accounts and divorce her. I was not the same vulnerable teenager who used to accept the blame for her toxic behavior. I refused to let her twist the narrative this time. I did not type out a long, emotional response defending my actions. I did not try to explain that I was protecting her from a devastating financial ruin. I did not offer her a single ounce of sibling comfort because she did not deserve it. Instead, I simply opened my photo gallery and selected a specific screenshot I had saved from yesterday afternoon. It was the exact text message she sent me when I was standing outside the venue gates. The message where she explicitly called me a ghetto teen mother and a stain on the Davis family legacy. The message where she proudly declared that my presence would disgust her prestigious new family and ruin her flawless aesthetic. I attached the screenshot to the chat and pressed send. I did not add a single word of commentary. The unarguable proof of her own malicious cruelty was the only response she deserved from me. The typing bubble on her end appeared for a brief second and then completely vanished. She was finally silenced by her own ugly reflection staring back at her. I turned off the screen and tossed the phone onto the plush sofa. I walked toward my daughter Maya, who was sitting at the dining table, happily eating her breakfast and reading an advanced science textbook. Her safety and happiness were the only things that truly mattered to me now. The toxic storm outside my penthouse could rage on without me. Just as I sat down next to her to ask about her reading, the intercom system on the wall chimed loudly. I pressed the button to connect with the front desk. The head of building security spoke with a strained and highly urgent tone. He informed me there was a highly agitated woman causing a massive disturbance in the main lobby. He said she was screaming at the guards, throwing her expensive handbag, and aggressively demanding to be let upstairs to see her daughter. I knew exactly who it was before he even finished his detailed description. My mother Evelyn had arrived. I instructed Maya to take her breakfast and her textbook into the media room and put on her noise-canceling headphones. She nodded, displaying an incredible maturity that always made my heart swell with absolute pride. I waited until the heavy oak door of the media room clicked shut, ensuring she would not hear any of the impending chaos. I turned my attention back to the intercom and told the head of security to let the screaming woman up to my floor. I knew exactly what my mother was trying to accomplish by showing up unannounced. She was desperate. She had just lost her social standing, her husband's corporate power, and her daughter's elite wedding in the span of 24 hours. She was coming here to unleash her fury and demand that I fix the catastrophic mess she created. She expected to bulldoze her way into my home and command my obedience just like she did when I was a helpless teenager. I walked over to the reinforced front door of my penthouse and unlocked the deadbolt. I stood tall in my own sanctuary, perfectly prepared for the confrontation. My mother was about to discover that the daughter she discarded was no longer a victim. I was the absolute master of my own domain, and I was ready for war. The heavy door swung open to reveal my mother standing in the hallway. Evelyn Davis looked nothing like the polished society matriarch who had hosted a $250,000 wedding just 24 hours ago. Her designer suit was deeply wrinkled, and her normally flawless hair was frayed. She barged past me into the foyer without waiting for a polite invitation. She immediately launched into her carefully rehearsed performance. She clasped her hands together and let out a dramatic, heavy sob. She told me she was absolutely heartbroken by the chaotic events of the previous day. She claimed she had not slept a single minute because she was worried about our fractured family. I closed the door quietly and leaned against the expensive hardwood frame. I watched her wipe imaginary tears from her heavily contoured cheeks. She paced across my luxurious living room, pretending to admire the art, while calculating how much money she could extract from me. She turned around and put on her most agonizing victim face. She told me I had successfully made my point and punished them enough for the past. She said it was time for me to be the bigger person and save my family from total financial ruin. She demanded $2 million to cover the Kensington debts and the ballroom brawl damages. She said if I did not give her the money, her elite sorority sisters would officially vote her off the alumni board. I walked over to the marble kitchen island and poured myself a glass of water. I calmly informed her that her social standing meant nothing to me. I told her I would not give her a single dime to fix a catastrophic mess she created with a racist con artist. My mother stopped weeping instantly. Her voice hardened into that familiar, demanding tone she used when I was a vulnerable teenager. She stepped closer and aggressively insisted that I owed her for the immense sacrifices she made raising me. She claimed her harshness was tough love to protect the Davis family reputation. She yelled that she did her absolute best as a mother to shield us from poverty and secure our place in Atlanta high society. I set my glass down on the counter with a heavy, resounding thud. I told her she was a spectacular liar. I walked over to a secure filing cabinet tucked inside my home office alcove. I retrieved a thick manila folder and brought it back to the kitchen island. I dropped it right in front of her shaking hands. I told her that folder would destroy her narrative about maternal sacrifice. I instructed her to open it and read the highlighted bank statements. My mother glared at me, but her overwhelming curiosity forced her to open the folder. Her eyes widened as she looked at the heavily documented financial records. I clinically explained exactly what she was holding. 10 years ago, when she threw me out into the cold street, she claimed it was because my teenage pregnancy ruined her pristine image. But the truth was entirely driven by her extreme greed. I told her I hired forensic accountants to trace the money my former boyfriend paid in child support after I was forced out. My ex-boyfriend came from a wealthy family who desperately wanted to avoid a public scandal. They had agreed to pay a massive monthly sum for my daughter Maya's care. I watched the blood drain from my mother's face as I narrated her crimes. I told her those child support payments never reached me or my struggling daughter. She had secretly intercepted the legal paperwork and rerouted every single monthly payment into a hidden private account under her own name. She let her own flesh and blood starve in extremely cramped apartments while she siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars explicitly meant for her infant granddaughter. I pointed to the transaction logs highlighting where the stolen money went. She did not use it to protect the Davis family legacy or secure their financial future. She used the stolen funds entirely to feed her massive and relentless shopping addiction. I read the highlighted receipts aloud in the quiet penthouse. I listed the expensive designer handbags she bought while I was struggling to buy baby formula. I listed the lavish country club spa treatments she paid for while I was working double shifts on my swollen feet. I listed the luxury vacations she took with her elite sorority sisters funded entirely by the money meant to keep my precious child warm. Her cruelty was never about protecting our family image from my supposed mistakes. Her cruelty was simply a convenient smokescreen to fund her desperate need to look wealthy to women who secretly despised her. My mother began to shake violently. The undeniable proof of her profound financial abuse stripped away her final layer of arrogant entitlement. She could no longer play the role of the strict but loving matriarch. She was exposed as nothing more than a selfish thief who stole from a vulnerable baby. I told her she was the true disgrace to the family name, and her entire existence was a pathetic fraud. The sheer humiliation of being completely dismantled by the daughter she viewed as worthless made her absolutely furious. All her fake tears and manipulative pleas vanished into thin air. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. She let out a loud, guttural scream and lunged forward across the kitchen island. She raised her right hand high into the air, winding up to deliver a truly vicious slap across my face. I did not flinch. I reached out and caught her wrist effortlessly in midair. My grip was like iron wrapping tightly around her arm, stopping her assault instantly. She gasped in shock and tried to pull away, but I held her firmly. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and lowered my voice to a dangerous whisper. I promise that if you touch me, you will be sleeping in a jail cell. The removal of my mother from my penthouse was merely the prelude to the corporate slaughter scheduled for the afternoon. I arrived at the headquarters of Apex Vanguard shortly before noon. My private elevator took me directly to the executive floor, where the atmosphere was heavily charged with untouchable power. I had barely settled into my chair when David walked in. His tablet was pulled up to the live security feed from the main lobby. He placed the screen on my desk. I watched the digital monitor. My father, Marcus Sr., and his fraudulent white son-in-law, Preston Kensington, were storming through the revolving glass doors. They marched aggressively toward the reception desk, projecting a false sense of authority. My father wore his most expensive suit, trying to intimidate my front desk staff. Preston flanked him, looking frantic compared to his usual arrogant posture. They demanded immediate access to the chief executive officer, acting as if they owned the skyscraper. I watched the head receptionist remain perfectly calm. She pressed the silent security button. Within seconds, 4 trained members of my private security detail materialized from the shadows. They seamlessly surrounded my father and Preston, cutting off their path to the elevators. My father began shouting, pointing his finger, and screaming about his corporate status. He demanded to be led upstairs immediately. I tapped my fingernails against my desk. I instructed David to have security escort them up to the secondary boardroom. I did not go to meet them right away. I made a deliberate choice to let them wait. I sat in my office and continued reviewing my reports for a full 60 minutes. I wanted the psychological weight of the silent boardroom to break their fragile egos. The secondary boardroom was designed specifically for hostile negotiations. The temperature was set to a crisp 60 degrees, and the chairs were notoriously rigid. I watched them on the surveillance feed during that long hour. Preston was pacing frantically back and forth. He was running his shaking hands through his blonde hair, sweating profusely despite the freezing air conditioning. My father sat at the far end of the conference table, tapping his phone and glaring at the locked doors. Their arrogant entitlement was morphing into suffocating panic. When 1 hour had passed, I finally stood up and smoothed the lines of my tailored charcoal pantsuit. I walked down the long corridor flanked by David and my security officer. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom and stepped inside. The dynamic of the room shifted the absolute second I crossed the threshold. My father instantly jumped up from his chair. He opened his mouth to shout his usual authoritarian commands, but the cold, empty expression on my face froze the words right in his throat. I did not greet him. I did not acknowledge his parental status. I walked slowly to the head of the conference table and sat down in the dominant chair. I placed my leather portfolio on the polished wood surface. I looked directly at Preston, who had suddenly stopped pacing. Preston scrambled to take the seat across from me. The vile, racist monster who screamed slurs into a microphone 24 hours ago was completely gone. In his place sat a desperate man, attempting to play the role of a civilized corporate diplomat. He leaned forward and forced a fake smile onto his sweating face. He dropped his thick Southern aristocrat drawl entirely. He adopted a smooth business tone and tried to compliment my impressive office building. He told me that family disagreements often get blown out of proportion and suggested we could easily resolve this misunderstanding like rational business partners. He was desperately trying to appeal to my corporate sensibilities, hoping I would prioritize financial diplomacy over the severe racial trauma he inflicted upon my family. Listening to his pathetic attempt at corporate negotiation filled me with a deep, intoxicating sense of vindication. For 2 years, Preston never missed an opportunity to patronize my intelligence. During suffocating family dinners, he would loudly mock my financial literacy. He constantly spoke down to me using complicated economic jargon, assuming a black woman could never comprehend the sophisticated nuances of his generational wealth. He treated me like an uneducated peasant who should be endlessly grateful just to sit at the same dining table as a Kensington. Now the tables were completely turned. The arrogant white aristocrat who viewed me as inferior was sweating completely through his expensive designer shirt. He was sitting in my building begging a black woman for absolute financial mercy. I did not return his fake smile. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I systematically dismantled his pathetic corporate facade in front of my father. I listed every single one of his catastrophic financial failures out loud. I recited the exact dollar amounts of his defaulted loans, his unpaid property taxes, and the massive hidden debts he concealed from my sister. I told him he was a desperate, cornered animal who tried to use my family as a disposable piggy bank. I watched his fake corporate smile collapse. The profound humiliation of being analytically destroyed by the very woman he deemed uncultured broke his spirit. His hands began to shake violently against the table. My father suddenly slammed his fist against the wood. Marcus Sr. glared at me with absolute fury, defending his fraudulent son-in-law. He angrily demanded that I release the frozen funds immediately. I ignored his shouting and unzipped my leather portfolio. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of legal paper. I pushed it slowly across the smooth wooden table until it stopped directly in front of Preston. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he read the bold heading. It was a formal, legally binding admission of guilt for international wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, detailing his full confession to targeting the Davis family for financial exploitation. I pulled a silver pen from my jacket pocket and tossed it onto the document. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my final ultimatum. I told him to simply sign it right now or the Federal Bureau of Investigation gets the unredacted files. The heavy silver pen rolled across the polished mahogany table and bumped gently against Preston's trembling hand. He stared down at the confession document, as if it were a venomous snake about to strike his throat. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. My private security guard stood perfectly still by the oak doors. David stood beside my chair with his tablet ready to transmit the files. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He looked desperately toward my father, silently pleading for the older man to use his patriarchal authority to save him from this total destruction. My father took the bait immediately. Marcus Sr. slammed both of his heavy hands onto the conference table. The sudden violent noise echoed loudly across the cold room. He turned his furious, glaring eyes entirely on me. His face was flushed with the same arrogant rage he used 10 years ago when he kicked me out into the rain. He demanded to know how a daughter of his could treat her own sister's husband with such absolute disrespect. He pointed a rigid finger at my face and yelled that Preston was a Kensington. He loudly declared that Preston came from a historic family and was a highly respected member of the elite community. He screamed the exact words I knew he would say. He shouted that Preston was family and I was maliciously tearing us apart. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I remained perfectly seated in my executive chair. I looked at the man who shared my DNA and felt absolutely no emotional connection to him. I calmly asked him why he was so incredibly desperate to protect a white man who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable walking automated teller machine. I told my father his deeply internalized racism and his desperate classism had completely blinded him to reality. For his entire life, he obsessed over gaining proximity to white generational wealth. He joined segregated country clubs and forced his family to assimilate to standards that inherently rejected our blackness. He was so blindingly eager to have a white aristocrat in family photos that he willingly ignored every single blaring financial red flag Preston displayed. He handed over his unquestioning loyalty to a blatant con artist simply because Preston had blonde hair and a historically wealthy last name. My father scoffed loudly and called my accusations ridiculous, bitter jealousy. He aggressively insisted that Preston was a brilliant financial mind, who was currently helping him secure massive offshore investments. He proudly announced that they had formed a joint venture to protect his extensive executive retirement portfolio. I smiled a very cold and unforgiving smile. I reached into my leather portfolio for the second time. I pulled out a thick stack of certified banking ledgers printed directly from the Southern Heritage Trust acquisition files. I did not hand them to Preston. I slid the heavy stack of papers directly across the table to my father. I instructed him to look at the highlighted transactions on the very first page. I told him to look at the offshore accounts he thought were securing his future. My father grabbed the papers with a confident sneer, fully expecting to see his millions safely accumulating interest. I watched his eyes scan the top line. The confident sneer instantly vanished. I watched his pupils dart frantically back and forth across the columns of numbers. He quickly flipped to the second page, and then the third. His hands began to shake just as violently as Preston's hands were shaking. I narrated the devastating truth out loud for everyone in the room to hear. I explained that the joint venture Preston proposed was nothing but an unregulated shell corporation. I told my father that Preston had not invested a single dime of the Davis family retirement funds. Instead, Preston completely liquidated my father's entire stock portfolio and drained his executive pension. He took decades of my father's hard-earned corporate wealth and used it to quietly pay off the Kensington family's massive underground gambling debts and their multiple defaulted estate loans. I pointed to the final page of the ledger. I told my father that his current retirement balance was exactly $0. The paper slipped from my father's trembling fingers and scattered across the mahogany table. He collapsed back into his rigid chair. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. The invincible corporate executive was completely gone. He looked at Preston with wide, horrified eyes. He finally realized the devastating magnitude of his own foolishness. He had sacrificed his relationship with his own biological daughter to appease a racist parasite. He had stolen my application code to build a fake empire, only to hand the entire kingdom over to a white man who secretly despised him. The crushing weight of his absolute financial ruin and his profound social humiliation broke him completely. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep loudly in the middle of my boardroom. Preston watched his only remaining shield crumble into a sobbing mess. The realization hit Preston instantly. My father was utterly broken and could no longer protect him from the severe legal consequences. The powerful Davis family money he relied on to save his own skin was completely gone forever. The terrifying federal indictment, sitting in his email inbox, was now his only guaranteed future in this world. Preston looked back at me, sitting calmly at the head of the polished table. The polite corporate diplomat facade he tried to maintain violently ripped apart. His pale face contorted into an ugly, twisted mask of pure, unhinged hatred. He realized a black woman had systematically dismantled his entire life and stripped away his unearned white privilege. He let out a feral, aggressive scream that echoed sharply off the glass walls. Preston kicked his heavy chair backward and violently lunged straight across the massive boardroom table directly toward me. Preston did not even make it halfway across the massive mahogany table. Before his outstretched hands could come anywhere near my face, my chief of security, Marcus, moved with absolute lightning speed. Marcus did not just block the aggressive attack. He grabbed Preston tightly by his expensive silk lapels and violently yanked his body forward, using the arrogant man's own reckless momentum entirely against him. Preston flipped over the sharp edge of the conference table and crashed incredibly hard onto the polished concrete floor. The sickening thud of his body hitting the ground echoed loudly through the freezing boardroom. He gasped for air as Marcus instantly pinned his arms behind his back, pressing a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades. The polished white aristocrat who thought he was completely untouchable was currently eating dust beneath the immaculate shoes of my highly trained security team. Preston thrashed wildly on the hard floor, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the heavy metal table legs. He screamed that I would pay dearly for this unprovoked assault. He yelled that he would have my entire security detail thrown in federal prison for daring to lay a single finger on a Kensington. I simply sat back in my plush executive chair and pressed a small silver button hidden beneath the edge of my desk. I did not need to wait for a verbal response. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung wide open. I had specifically instructed David to have local law enforcement waiting quietly in the main lobby the exact moment Preston and my father entered the skyscraper. 4 uniformed police officers marched directly into the tense room, with their hands resting on their duty belts. The lead officer took one look at the chaotic scene and immediately instructed Marcus to step back. The officers hauled Preston up from the floor and forcefully slammed his chest against the thick glass wall of the conference room. They pulled his arms backward, and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed with absolute devastating finality. Preston began hyperventilating instantly. He looked at the stern police officers in total disbelief. He shouted that there was a massive misunderstanding and aggressively demanded they arrest me instead. The lead officer calmly read Preston his Miranda rights. He explicitly stated that Preston was being placed under immediate arrest for attempted physical assault and suspected international wire fraud. The officer expertly patted down his tailored suit pockets and confiscated his mobile phone to be held as federal evidence. The harsh reality of the cold steel handcuffs finally broke the very last shred of Preston's fragile sanity. The sophisticated corporate diplomat mask melted away entirely. He completely reverted to the vile, bigoted monster I had captured on that country club locker room audio recording. He began violently thrashing against the tight grip of the officers and screaming at the absolute top of his lungs. He hurled the most disgusting racial slurs directly at my face and then turned his vicious verbal attack entirely onto my father. He yelled that we were nothing but uncultured animals who got lucky in the stock market. He screamed that his historic family built this entire country, and we had absolutely no right to touch his generational wealth. He cursed the specific day he ever stepped foot into our filthy new money house. He spat violently on my polished floor and swore he would destroy every single one of us the moment his mother posted his bail. I did not say a single word to him. I simply watched in deep satisfaction as the officers dragged him kicking and screaming out of the boardroom. I turned my attention entirely to my father. Marcus Sr. was still sitting frozen in his rigid chair. He was completely paralyzed. His eyes were wide and filled with absolute, undeniable horror. He had just watched his absolute greatest achievement, his perfect, prestigious white son-in-law, morph into a rabid, racist criminal right before his very eyes. My father spent his entire adult life trying desperately to escape his own blackness. He joined highly segregated country clubs. He constantly policed my tone and my hair. He threw me out onto the cold street because my teenage pregnancy directly threatened his proximity to white elitism. He sacrificed his own flesh and blood to worship blindly at the altar of the Kensington family name. Now the ultimate prize he sacrificed me for had just called him a dirty animal directly to his face. The beautiful, flawless facade my father built his entire identity upon was utterly shattered into a million jagged pieces. He watched the determined officers force Preston into the elevator, and the heavy doors slid completely shut. The muffled sounds of Preston's racist screaming finally faded away, leaving the boardroom suffocatingly quiet. My father slowly lowered his heavy head until his chin rested against his chest. His broad shoulders shook as silent tears fell rapidly onto his expensive designer tie. The absolute magnitude of his own self-hatred and his colossal financial foolishness crushed him completely. He had traded his loyal daughter, his brilliant granddaughter, and his entire corporate legacy for a racist parasite who secretly despised him. I sat perfectly still in my chair and watched him weep. 10 years ago, I cried exactly like that when he slammed the front door of our family estate in my face. I remembered begging him to let me stay because it was freezing outside, and I was carrying his vulnerable grandchild. He had looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust and told me I was a worthless burden. Today, I felt absolutely no pity for the broken man sitting across from me. He was finally experiencing the exact same agonizing rejection he forced me to endure. The universe had simply balanced the scales of justice without any mercy. My father took a long, trembling breath and finally raised his head. His eyes were bright red and completely hollow. He looked around the freezing boardroom and then looked directly into my eyes. He was totally and completely defeated. His proud, authoritarian posture was entirely gone. He spoke with a weak, raspy voice that barely carried across the quiet table. He asked me what I wanted from him. He asked if I was going to send him to federal prison alongside Preston for the fraudulent offshore accounts he blindly approved. He begged me to just tell him exactly how to end this horrific nightmare. I picked up the heavy silver pen from the table. I reached into my leather portfolio for the third and final time. I pulled out a single sheet of premium paper and slid it slowly across the smooth wood. The document stopped right in front of his shaking hands. I looked at the man who gave me life and then recklessly threw it away. I told him I did not want his money or his fake, tearful apologies. I told him to read the bold print at the very top of the page. It was a legally binding document outlining his immediate, unconditional, and forced resignation from his own company. I told him to sign it right now and walk out of my building forever. My father stared at the resignation document for a long, agonizing moment. He picked up the heavy silver pen and signed his name with a violently trembling hand. He did not say another word as my security team escorted him out of the boardroom and guided him into the designated elevator. The corporate purge was officially complete. I sat alone in the quiet boardroom, feeling a profound sense of absolute control. But the total demolition of my family was still actively unfolding across the city. While my father was losing his fake corporate empire, my sister Chloe was experiencing a brutal awakening of her own. She had rushed frantically to the downtown Atlanta police precinct to rescue her racist husband. Chloe marched into the busy local precinct, completely ignoring the stark contrast between her elite lifestyle and the gritty reality of the local justice system. She was still wearing the expensive white silk reception dress she had changed into before the wedding brawl erupted. The delicate fabric was stained with spilled champagne, and her designer heels clicked aggressively against the scuffed linoleum floor. She demanded to speak with the desk sergeant, acting as if her high society status gave her supreme authority over local law enforcement. The tired desk officer barely looked up from his computer. He coldly informed her that Preston Kensington was currently being held in federal custody on suspected wire fraud and aggravated assault charges. He told her the preliminary bail was set at a massive figure. Chloe scoffed arrogantly. She proudly pulled out her exclusive platinum debit card. This was her deeply guarded personal account. It held all the accumulated wealth she had received from my parents over the years, along with the generous cash gifts she collected during her various bridal showers. She slapped the premium plastic card onto the counter, fully expecting to buy her husband's freedom and sweep the entire humiliating ordeal under the rug. The officer swiped the card through the machine. The terminal emitted a loud, harsh beep, followed by a bright red denial message. Chloe glared at the officer and aggressively demanded he swipe it again, claiming the precinct equipment was clearly broken. The officer swiped it a second time with the exact same resulting failure. He slid the useless card back across the scratched counter and told her she had insufficient funds. Chloe snatched the card back, her face flushing with indignant rage. She quickly pulled out her smartphone and opened her secure banking application, ready to prove the officer wrong. She stared down at the brightly illuminated screen. The blood completely drained from her face. Her primary account balance displayed exactly $0. Chloe tapped the screen frantically, refreshing the application over and over again. The balance did not change. She opened her detailed transaction history, and her eyes widened in absolute horror. Just moments before Preston was tackled in my boardroom, he had initiated a massive external wire transfer. He completely drained her personal savings account, sweeping every single dime she owned into a non-refundable retainer fee for a high-powered criminal defense attorney. Preston knew the federal agents were closing in, and he ruthlessly sacrificed his new bride's entire financial safety net to save his own skin. He left her completely broke, standing in a dingy police station wearing a ruined wedding dress. The crushing reality of her absolute poverty hit Chloe like a physical blow. She staggered backward away from the bail window, completely unable to breathe. Chloe had never survived a single day in her life without access to massive amounts of money. She had absolutely no basic life skills. My parents had pampered her since birth, shielding her from any real-world responsibilities. She did not know how to cook a basic meal or pay a standard utility bill. She had never written a professional resume or applied for a regular job. Her entire identity and survival depended entirely on spending other people's money and looking flawless while doing it. Now she had absolutely nothing. Her parents were bankrupt. Her husband was a thief behind bars. She was entirely alone. My personal mobile phone vibrated against the mahogany conference table. The caller identification displayed my sister's name. I picked up the device and accepted the call. I did not say a word. I just listened to the sound of Chloe sobbing hysterically into the microphone. Her confident, arrogant facade was completely destroyed. She gasped for air and begged me to help her. She cried that Preston had stolen all her money and left her stranded at the local precinct. She pleaded with me to send a luxury car to pick her up and begged for a massive cash loan to help her secure a premium hotel room for the night. She shamelessly tried to use the biological sister card, claiming that family must always stick together during times of severe crisis. I sat back in my executive chair and took a slow sip of cold water. I reminded her of the phone call we had just 24 hours ago when I was standing outside her wedding venue. I reminded her that she called me a ghetto teen mother and a disgusting stain on the Davis family legacy. I told her she specifically demanded I go back to my broke, miserable life and stay away from her elite social circle. I clinically informed her that she was currently experiencing the exact broke, miserable life she had so happily wished upon me. Chloe wailed loudly through the phone, promising she would do absolutely anything to earn my forgiveness. She swore she would publicly apologize to me and my daughter if I just gave her enough money to survive the week. I smiled coldly. I told her I would not give her a single unearned dollar. I told her she was finally going to learn exactly how the real world operates for people without white privilege or stolen generational wealth. I offered her one single option. I told her my corporation owned a subsidiary customer service call center located on the outskirts of the city. I offered her an entry-level position answering phones for angry retail customers making the exact state minimum wage. I told her the shifts were strictly 10 hours long, and she would be closely monitored by a strict supervisor. Chloe gasped in disgust and shouted that a Davis woman does not work in a miserable call center. I did not entertain her childish outrage. I lowered my voice to a sharp, commanding tone. I told her she was no longer a wealthy socialite. I told her to take the job or starve. I hung up the phone and left her to face her brand new reality. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the smooth mahogany desk. The profound silence in my office was a beautiful contrast to the chaotic desperation of my sister. 1 full week passed since the catastrophic events of the wedding. 7 days was all it took for the absolute destruction of my family's carefully curated social empire. The viral videos of the grand ballroom brawl had completely saturated every single corner of the Atlanta elite community. There was no public relations spin that could possibly save my mother from the severe consequences of her own actions. Evelyn Davis had spent decades clawing her way to the very top of the social ladder. She sacrificed her own daughter to appease the wealthy aristocrats she so desperately wanted to emulate. Now she was experiencing a rapid and brutal descent into the harsh reality of complete social exile. Her flawless reputation was permanently reduced to ash. The first devastating blow landed on Tuesday afternoon. My mother was summoned to an emergency closed-door meeting with the executive alumni board of her prestigious sorority. For her entire adult life, those elite women were her ultimate source of validation. She used to proudly host their charity galas and weaponize her membership to look down on working-class women like the teenage version of me. The board members did not offer her a warm sisterly embrace. They sat her down and presented her with a formal letter of immediate expulsion. They clinically cited the incredibly public embarrassment of the wedding brawl and the severe financial fraud committed by her husband as direct violations of their strict moral clauses. The very women she had worshipped and tried to impress by abandoning me looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. They stripped her of her prestigious letters and escorted her out of the building. She was completely shunned by the only community she ever truly cared about. By Friday, my mother was spiraling in a state of absolute denial. Refusing to accept her new status as a social pariah, she decided to seek refuge at her exclusive country club. This was the same heavily segregated establishment my father used to run before I forced his resignation. Evelyn put on her most expensive vintage designer dress and marched through the grand front doors, acting as if her life was perfectly intact. She confidently ordered an expensive champagne brunch on the outdoor terrace surrounded by the wealthiest families in the state. She desperately tried to engage her old friends in casual conversation, but they all quickly turned their backs and actively ignored her presence. They treated her like a highly contagious disease. When the server brought her the final bill, my mother confidently handed over her country club membership card to charge the account. She completely forgot that without my father's executive salary and without the stolen funds from my child support, her accounts were entirely empty. The server swiped the card and received a glaring red error message for massively delinquent dues. The general manager of the club walked over to her table with 2 large security guards. He did not lower his voice to spare her feelings. He loudly informed her that her family membership was officially revoked due to severe financial delinquency and the recent criminal investigations surrounding her husband. He ordered her to vacate the private premises immediately. I watched the entire humiliating scene unfold from the VIP balcony directly above the terrace. I was not hiding in the shadows. I was sitting at the most exclusive reserved table in the entire establishment, enjoying a premium imported tea. Earlier that week, I had my wealth management team purchase a platinum tier membership, making me one of the highest-ranking financial contributors to the club. The same wealthy socialites who used to whisper cruel insults about the ghetto teen mother were now sending complimentary bottles of wine to my table. They smiled and bowed their heads in deep reverence to my immense wealth. They completely rejected my abusers while desperately clamoring for my corporate approval. It was the ultimate role reversal. I watched my mother being physically escorted across the manicured lawn by security. She looked up at the balcony and locked eyes with me. My mother stood completely frozen on the pristine green grass. She stared up at me, fully comprehending the massive shift in our power dynamic. The daughter she threw away like garbage was now the undisputed queen of her highly coveted social circle. I raised my porcelain teacup and offered her a very slow, mocking toast. She covered her face with her shaking hands and began to weep loudly. The security guards did not hesitate. They grabbed her firmly by the arms and dragged her crying form away from the luxurious patio area. I felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders as I watched her disappear. The toxic generational curse she tried to force upon me was officially broken forever. The absolute horror on her face was deeply satisfying. She finally realized the society she sacrificed me for was now completely owned by me. Her elite world had entirely rejected her and crowned me as their new superior. She stumbled out of the heavy iron gates carrying nothing but her profound shame. I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I simply turned my attention back to my smartphone as a highly anticipated calendar alert vibrated against the table. The digital notification flashed across my screen demanding my immediate attention. The legal grace period had officially expired, and the Kensington family had officially lost the battle for their historic mansion. The highly publicized foreclosure auction for Preston's ancestral estate was scheduled to begin in exactly 1 hour. I signaled for my security team and stood up from the table. I was not just going to purchase their precious home remotely through a proxy. I was heading to the county courthouse to attend the foreclosure auction in person. I stepped out of my vehicle and looked up at the towering concrete steps of the county courthouse. The heavy Atlanta heat clung uncomfortably to my skin, but I felt absolutely invigorated and perfectly ready for battle. Today was the day the historic Kensington mansion officially went on the public auction block. I walked up the wide steps flanked by my chief of security, Marcus, and the rest of my highly trained detail. The public foreclosure auction was being held in the sprawling main atrium of the municipal building. I bypassed the crowded security lines using my expedited corporate access and headed straight for the designated bidding floor. A modest crowd of local real estate investors, property flippers, and curious onlookers had already gathered in the center of the echoing room. Right in the middle of the crowd stood Preston's mother. She was wearing a severely outdated but highly recognizable designer suit, desperately clinging to the very last remnants of her shattered social dignity. Her husband stood rigidly beside her, looking completely hollowed out and entirely defeated. I watched from a discreet distance near the marble pillars as she aggressively approached several potential buyers. She was actively using her historic white aristocratic last name to boldly intimidate the local investors. I listened as she hissed at them to back off, claiming her family had a secret private arrangement with the bank to buy the estate back through a proxy shell corporation. She actually threatened to ruin their local businesses if they dared to bid on her precious ancestral home. Her pathetic bullying tactics were visibly working on the smaller independent investors who still deeply feared the old money aristocracy of the South and the powerful political connections they falsely claimed to hold. They nervously lowered their bidding paddles and backed away from her. The court-appointed auctioneer finally stepped up to the wooden podium and brought down his heavy gavel. He formally announced the Kensington estate foreclosure and opened the floor for initial bidding. Preston's mother immediately raised her numbered paddle and called out an insultingly low starting bid. She looked around the atrium with a smug, arrogant smile, fully expecting the intimidated crowd to remain perfectly silent. She honestly thought she had successfully manipulated the legal system to steal her massive house back for absolute pennies on the dollar. Her smug smile vanished the exact second I raised my own paddle high into the air. I did not just counter her pathetic bid. I loudly announced a figure that immediately doubled it. The entire atrium gasped and turned around to look at me. Preston's mother whipped her head toward the back of the room and locked eyes with me. Pure, unadulterated hatred deeply twisted her pale face. She raised her paddle again and screamed out a slightly higher number. I did not even wait for the auctioneer to acknowledge her desperate attempt. I raised my paddle and doubled the amount again without a single moment of hesitation. A brutal and entirely one-sided bidding war rapidly erupted across the courthouse floor. Every single time she frantically called out a number, I instantly crushed her hopes with an overwhelmingly higher figure. Her voice grew increasingly shrill and frantic with every single bid. She was bidding with heavily borrowed proxy funds and maxed out illegal credit lines. I was bidding with the limitless liquid capital of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I was playing a corporate game she simply could not afford to participate in. Within 2 excruciating minutes, she was completely tapped out. She lowered her shaking paddle as the auctioneer called out the final warning to the silent room. Going once, going twice. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down, echoing loudly across the marble atrium. sold to Apex Vanguard. I had just officially purchased the historic Kensington estate for an absolute fraction of its actual market value. The generational wealth she maliciously weaponized against my family for years was now officially and legally mine to control entirely. I walked slowly and purposefully across the wide atrium directly toward Preston's devastated mother. She was hyperventilating wildly and clutching her husband's arm for physical support. I stopped right in front of her trembling frame. I looked down at the woman who spent years calling my family uncultured thugs. 5 years ago, during a suffocating charity gala, she had assumed I was part of the catering staff simply because of the color of my skin. She had rudely snapped her fingers at me and tried to hand me a crumpled $100 bill, commanding me to fetch her a fresh cocktail. I never forgot that specific humiliation. I reached into my custom-tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. I held it out and deliberately pressed the stiff paper currency firmly against her shaking, wrinkled palm. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and spoke with absolute freezing clarity. I told her to use the money for her Uber ride home because she was currently trespassing on my private property. The racist matriarch let out a sharp, agonizing gasp and burst into loud, uncontrollable sobs right there on the public courthouse floor. Her husband quickly grabbed her arm and practically dragged her toward the exit to escape the staring crowd. I turned my back on their complete destruction and walked out of the municipal building feeling utterly victorious. When I settled back into the quiet luxury of my armored vehicle, my personal phone pinged with an urgent incoming email notification. The sender identification displayed on the bright screen made me laugh out loud. It was a joint email from my newly bankrupt parents, Marcus Sr. and Evelyn. They were now totally broke and desperately begging me to let them live rent-free in the newly purchased Kensington mansion to save them from impending homelessness. It was the absolute pathetic conclusion to their lifelong obsession with white elite society. I sat in the plush leather seat of my armored vehicle and stared at the digital screen. My parents had the absolute audacity to ask if they could live in the Kensington mansion. They tried to appeal to my sense of family loyalty. They claimed they were destitute and facing imminent eviction from their temporary apartment. They promised they would maintain the historic property and act as caretakers if I simply gave them a place to stay. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy for their self-inflicted poverty. I tapped the reply button and typed a brief response. I informed them that their request was entirely impossible. I wrote that the property was scheduled for immediate demolition tomorrow morning. I added that the cleared land would be used to build a community center and housing complex exclusively for single minority mothers. I hit send and permanently blocked their email addresses. The next morning, I stood on the sidewalk across from the massive Kensington estate. The humid Atlanta air was thick with the smell of exhaust and churning diesel engines. A fleet of heavy construction vehicles and massive yellow bulldozers idled loudly on the pristine front lawn. The historic white columns and the wraparound southern porch looked like a monument to a racist past that was finally about to fall. I signaled my lead project manager. The largest bulldozer lurched forward with a deafening mechanical roar. The heavy steel blade slammed directly into the grand entrance of the mansion. The ancient wood splintered and cracked loudly as the front facade completely caved in. I watched a cloud of thick white dust billow up into the blue sky. The physical embodiment of Preston's arrogant white privilege and my parents' desperate social climbing was being crushed into unrecognizable rubble. I stood there until the entire front half of the house collapsed into the ground. While I was watching the demolition of a fake empire, my sister Chloe was experiencing the brutal reality of the working class. She had officially started her first week at the subsidiary customer service call center. I forced her to join. The facility was located in a drab gray building on the far industrial outskirts of the city. Chloe was sitting in a cramped gray cubicle surrounded by hundreds of other exhausted workers. She was wearing a cheap polyester uniform shirt that scratched her skin. Her designer wedding gown and diamond tiaras were completely gone. They had been seized by creditors to pay off the massive legal retainers Preston racked up before his federal indictment. She had no makeup on and heavy bags hung under her bloodshot eyes. For her entire life, Chloe never had to lift a single finger to survive. My parents handed her everything on a silver platter. Now she was forced to wear a heavy plastic headset for 10 grueling hours a day. She spent every single minute getting yelled at by angry retail customers over missing packages and delayed refunds. She had to politely apologize to strangers who insulted her intelligence and demanded to speak to her manager. If she talked back or rolled her eyes, she would receive a formal warning that threatened her minimum wage paycheck. She had to carefully budget her lunch money just to afford a sandwich from the vending machine. She was living the exact exhausting broke lifestyle she aggressively mocked me for enduring 10 years ago. She had to survive entirely on her own merit without stolen wealth shielding her from the real world. My father, Marcus Sr., was faring no better in his grim new reality. The once powerful chief executive officer was currently working as a mid-level financial consultant at a highly mediocre suburban firm. He sat in a tiny, windowless office, taking direct orders from young managers he used to arrogantly look down upon. He had to bite his tongue and nod politely when they criticized his outdated corporate strategies. He no longer had an expense account or a corner office overlooking the city skyline. He had to clock in exactly at 8 in the morning and pack his own lunch in a brown paper bag. My mother Evelyn was completely trapped in a small two-bedroom apartment with him. She spent her days aggressively pacing the cheap laminate floors, mourning her lost social status. She had absolutely no friends left to call. Her elite sorority sisters universally blocked her number. She could no longer afford her weekly spa treatments or expensive highlights. The flawless society matriarch was reduced to clipping grocery store coupons just to afford basic necessities. They were isolated in a prison constructed entirely by their relentless greed. I left the demolition site and returned to the absolute peace of my highly secure downtown penthouse. The heavy oak doors locked behind me, sealing away the toxic noise of the outside world. I walked into the bright sunlit living room and took a deep breath of clean air. My brilliant 10-year-old daughter Maya was sitting on the plush sofa with a glowing smile on her face. She jumped up the second she saw me and ran across the room. She threw her arms around my waist and hugged me incredibly tight. She stepped back and shoved a thick cream-colored envelope into my hands. I looked at the premium paper. The wax seal on the back bore the official crest of the National Academy for Gifted Sciences. It was the most prestigious and highly competitive academic institution in the entire country. I opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp letter. Maya pointed eagerly at the bold text printed right at the top of the page. The text printed at the top of the page confirmed her full admission into the elite accelerated program with a complete academic scholarship based entirely on her test scores. I dropped the letter onto the coffee table and pulled my daughter into another hug. We spun around the living room laughing loudly together in pure celebration of our peace. Looking down at her beaming face, I realized the ultimate victory had nothing to do with destroying my parents or bankrupting my arrogant sister. My true victory was ensuring this brilliant child would never experience the agonizing rejection I endured. The toxic generational curse of conditional love and suffocating elitism was officially broken in our bloodline. Maya would never have to change her natural hair or silence her intelligent voice to please a room full of judgmental, superficial socialites. She would never have to beg for a seat at any table because she already owned the entire room. I promised myself long ago that her absolute brilliance would be fiercely protected from their relentless daily cruelty. I walked back out onto my balcony later that same beautiful evening while Maya was busy setting up her expensive science equipment. The sprawling city of Atlanta sparkled directly below me like an ocean of gold and white lights. I leaned heavily against the cool glass railing and took a moment to reflect on the journey of the past few weeks. Just a short time ago, I was standing outside the heavy iron gates of the Rosewood Estate, wearing an emerald dress and holding a black velvet box. My own mother had banned me from that venue because she thought my mere existence was a disgusting stain on her fake aristocratic image. She firmly believed she could simply lock me out of her flawless high society world and force me to remain forever invisible. She had absolutely no idea that I did not just hold the master keys to those massive iron gates. I owned the entire luxury property and the very ground she was proudly standing on. The consequences for the people who tried to destroy me were absolute and irreversible. Preston Kensington did not manage to charm his way out of the federal indictment. His expensive defense attorney abandoned him the exact second his stolen retainer funds ran dry. The federal prosecutors used the comprehensive digital dossier I provided to secure a swift conviction for international wire fraud and attempted corporate embezzlement. The judge sentenced the arrogant racist aristocrat to 5 hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his tailored tuxedos and exclusive country club lockers for a standard issue orange jumpsuit and a cold concrete cell. Chloe filed for divorce immediately, but it did not save her from absolute total financial ruin. She still takes the early morning public bus to the industrial call center on the far outskirts of the city. She spends her long days getting screamed at by angry retail customers for minimum wage while she desperately struggles to pay the rent on her tiny cramped apartment. She finally learned what it feels like to survive without a stolen financial safety net, to catch her inevitable fall. My parents faced the same brutal reality. Marcus Sr., the man who stole my application code to build his fake empire, now works as a mid-level consultant at a mediocre suburban firm. He takes orders from young managers who constantly criticize his outdated corporate strategies. He no longer has an expense account or a corner office overlooking the city skyline. Evelyn Davis, the former Flawless Society matriarch, is completely trapped in a small 2-bedroom apartment with him. She spends her miserable days aggressively pacing the cheap laminate floors, mourning her permanently lost social status. She has absolutely no wealthy friends left to call. Her elite sorority sisters universally blocked her phone number the exact second the public financial scandal broke across the local news. She can no longer afford her weekly luxury spa treatments or expensive blonde highlights. They are completely isolated in a miserable, quiet prison, constructed entirely by their relentless greed and their toxic obsession with white elitism. They sacrificed their only loyal daughter for a racist con artist, and they ended up with absolutely nothing left to their disgraced family name. I took one last look at the glowing city skyline before turning back to the warmth of my penthouse. The painful rejection I faced 10 years ago was the absolute best thing that ever happened to my growth. Being thrown out into the pouring rain forced me to discover a level of relentless strength I never knew I possessed. I stopped waiting for my toxic family to accept me and started building a massive private equity empire that could easily buy and sell their entire social circle. I actively turned my deep, agonizing trauma into billions of dollars in liquid assets and total corporate control. The sweet taste of justice is incredibly profound today. If you are watching this video right now and you are currently dealing with toxic family members who constantly belittle your immense worth or treat you like a shameful burden, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not need their flawed validation to become incredibly successful in this world. You do not need their conditional approval to live a beautiful and fulfilling life. Never let anyone tell you your seat is not at the table. Build your own table and charge them rent. Have you ever had to bravely walk away from a toxic family environment to protect your own peace and future? Tell me your incredible story in the comments section below. I read every single one. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of ultimate survival and sweet revenge. Thank you for watching this video today, and always remember that your true power always belongs exclusively to you, forever and always. Right now, she was using that exact premium credit card to simply pay for 5 massive luxury hotel suites for the Kensington family, eager to prove she finally belonged in their extremely high tax bracket. I opened the secure banking application on my phone and navigated to her specific account. I saw the pending charges racking up thousands of dollars in hospitality fees. I did not reply to her cruel text message. Instead, I pressed the freeze account button. I locked the credit card permanently. My mother had just banned me from her daughter's wedding to protect her elite image. Now she could figure out exactly how to pay for it while standing at the front desk of a luxury hotel in front of her prestigious new in-laws.